He is worthy, amen. All right, well, we are going to be continuing with our short little 2-week deep dive into apologetics. You all had an extra hour of sleep, so I expect your minds to be even sharper than last week. We're going to cover a few more topics today. Last week we talked about what apologetics is, why it's necessary, and we got started by looking at 3 arguments for God's existence. We learned that the beginning of the universe points to a beginner, the fine-tuning of the universe points to a fine-tuner, and that DNA points to an author of life. If you missed it, you can find it on YouTube or from our website, icwhidbey.org. Just go there. The top right says sermons, and it should take you to our latest message. That's where you can watch last week's or any other one that we have before. Today, we're going to take a look at some different topics like consciousness, morality, the Bible, and the resurrection. And we will end by quickly touching on how apologetics can really meet our modern world where it's at. And I'll end by giving you the best questions to ask in any tough conversation. So, let's start today with argument number 4. So, number 4 is the argument from consciousness. Basically, human consciousness points to a cosmic consciousness. John Lennox mentioned him a couple times last week and watched a video from him. In his book, Cosmic Chemistry, opens up his chapter on the mind with the following. He says, "One of the greatest mysteries yet to be unraveled by science is how the human mind and brain are linked. With the mind, we associate ideas of conscious thought, intention, ideas, and emotions, whereas the brain is a physical organ contained in the human skull." He's writing this. He says, "At this moment, I am thinking of the next word to write. My thought activates neurons in my brain and causes various impulses to flow to my hands, to cause the muscles to contract and expand so that my fingers transfer the contents of my thought onto a computer. How does that mental activity cause the physical activity? Nobody seems to know." One other writer reminds us that God has given us science to help us understand things as they are through the study of creation. And one important part of this is our own physiology. In simple terms, God has revealed himself through the world around us. And the study of this is called natural theology. We saw a lot of it last week. The miracle and wonder of the human body is but one part of that study. And this argument seeks to point out not just the brain, but the mind. The human consciousness remains one of the most understudied and unknown concepts about the human body. This is mostly because we don't really have a solid way of measuring it, but also because we have no example of consciousness ever existing outside of a human. So in other words, we've never witnessed consciousness just hanging out on its own somewhere. If there is no God, and everything came to be into existence just through physical laws, how do we get a conscious being such as ourselves through matter alone? Put another way, how does an immaterial thing, such as the mind, come from matter alone? Philosopher Stan Wallace reminds us that out of nothing, nothing comes. So out of a material brain can only come other material things. This is to say that the brain itself cannot create the mind that we have. It can play host to it, but it can't create it. We can't explain thoughts and pain and sensation and ideas in purely physical terms. There is an aspect of us that is not physical. If there weren't, then anything we do would simply be the result of biological functioning. Neurons firing that we are not in control of or responsible for. And people do believe this. It's a view called physicalism. And the existence of immaterial things, such as consciousness and even mathematics, drive a hard nail into the belief that only a physical or material world exists. In fact, even the discovery of quantum mechanics, once thought to be an explanation for the unexplainable, has possibly become a way to disprove materialism. Not going to go into that. I know almost nothing about quantum mechanics. But what's more is that science cannot even explain the existence of immaterial things like mathematics, because as John Polkinghorne tells us, he says science does not explain the mathematical intelligibility of the physical world, for it is part of science's founding faith that this is so. Science is, after all, the observation of the natural world by way of these mathematical laws. Without them, science cannot be done. And one other thing, I mentioned this kind of briefly last week in a quote, but what is the tool that we are using science to do? Our mind. So science relies on two immaterial things in order to even operate: the mind and mathematical laws. How about one step deeper, okay? The pursuit of truth in science. One could say that the goal of science is to find truth, or to discover what is true. But this assumes that there is truth to find in the first place, and that the search for truth is even a worthwhile endeavor. And of course, if you doubt that, you're assuming that your immaterial mind is worth trusting. At the very foundation of science lies a deep trust in things that science itself cannot measure or prove, meaning that science requires a great deal of faith. This is one of the ways that we refute lies, through argumentation. This argument that I'm using right now particularly is known as the argument from absurdity. Basically, you take the idea to its logical end. So where do these ideas lead? All right, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas don't just have bad consequences, they have victims. So what are the eventual consequences of believing that we are nothing but subjects of biological functioning? Well, one consequence is that no one's really responsible for their actions. It's extreme, but one could claim, I wasn't responsible for murdering that person. I'm just the subject of a series of neurons firing on their own which caused my actions. Yet this is not true, and we have an entire justice system that exists to oppose this understanding. Punishment for bad behavior has always existed. And this is so because we believe that people are responsible for their actions. You see, without God, people are left to find explanations for things based on purely physical and material terms. We trust that last week. Even if you want to say that consciousness evolved, you're going to have to explain how and at what point in the process of human evolution did consciousness begin? Why and how did we at one point not have it, and then at another point did have it? And what caused it? What material process caused a non-material thing to exist? Answers to these questions take a lot of faith. Faith in what? Science. Science is wonderful and has led to tons of life-saving and human race-improving discoveries. But placing our faith in science has led to an entire religion called scientism. Now, there's a lot to this argument, but the best explanation for the origin of consciousness is a divine mind behind the universe. And the most likely source of that divine mind is God. Okay, next one. Number 5 is the moral argument. An objective moral law points to a moral law giver. This is maybe the most powerful argument for today, as we live in a culture that tells us to define truth however we want, and because we all make moral claims each and every day. Yet many of us don't stop to consider, why and how do I know that something is right or wrong? If it's simply human decision or social construct, then any idea of right or wrong is subjective and up to each person to define. There's no authority other than yourself to tell me what is right and wrong. And evolution doesn't quite explain morality either. The understanding to not murder didn't simply evolve over time, because murder would probably be an effective method for survival of the fittest. In fact, some pretty evil people throughout time have actually cited that as their justification. Now, many atheists might go wrong when they attempt to explain how they can also believe that some things are morally wrong without God. They would usually ground this belief in the fact that we can know things conceptually, like it's just plain fact. That all we need to have is exposure to these facts in order to believe them. But where did those facts come from? Where did that common sense come from? You see, that's the missing point. The argument here is not concerned with whether or not we are able to believe these truths with or without God. Clearly, Christians and non-Christians are capable of being morally good people. This argument is proving that there is no explanation for the existence of these truths without God, an objective source of truth. Something is not wrong simply because a group of people agreed on it being wrong. In other words, something is not wrong simply because a law exists against it. We know this because laws regarding moral issues come and go with which plenty of people on either side vehemently disagree with. In fact, there is no such thing as a morally neutral law. Greg Koukl says this: when any human court is the highest authority, then morality is reduced to mere power. If you study history, you'll see how this has been true for almost every civilization and country and people group, including the church. Something is wrong because it is the opposite of good. But this requires us to know what good is. And unless we are neurologically disadvantaged, we all inherently know what good is when we call something evil. The only caveat I would add to this is if we've been confused and clouded by culture war ideologies which water down the word evil and just end up playing this us versus them game. Genesis describes how God breathed life into humans and passed on his image to us. Romans 2 tells us that God wrote the understanding of right and wrong on our hearts and that our conscience accuses us of wrongdoing. This is ultimately what kick-started C.S. Lewis's conversion. He writes this in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" Again, the reason this argument is so powerful right now is because of the society we live in. We live in a time dominated by what is called relativism. This is the belief that whatever is true for you is true for you, and whatever is true for me is true for me. I set this up last week. Relativism is baked into our culture at this point. Phrases like, you do you, live your truth, love is love, follow your heart, look inside and be yourself, and the ever-popular, who are you to judge? These are all examples of relativism. But the problem is us. We, by ourselves, are not virtuous people. We're broken, and every worldview acknowledges this. Every single person will believe that something is wrong with the world and will likely have a way of solving that. If you tell me to just be me, to look inside myself, I'll tell you what I find: a judgmental, often unloving, and sinful person. Why is it good for me to then follow my heart? There's a great analogy that I came across which demonstrates this really well. I might have shared this before, but it goes like this. Telling those who aren't virtuous to look inside is like telling them to find their way out of a wilderness using a compass that always points at them. A compass works because it points to something fixed and unchanging, by which we can orient ourselves and find our way. Unless there is a fixed moral reference point outside of ourselves by which we can make moral decisions, we'll always be lost. Following your heart won't work unless your heart knows where it's going. And by default, our hearts do not know up from down, morally speaking. And this is why that fixed moral reference point cannot be another human, because they are in the same position. A couple of examples. Take the phrase, "Who are you to judge?" All right, this statement means you cannot judge, which is a judgment. The claim that someone has no right to make judgments is itself a judgment, which makes the whole thing self-refuting. Another one, if we truly took this subjective morality to its logical end, right, this argument from absurdity, then Mother Teresa would be no better or worse than Hitler. Or murder could just be someone's truth, and wrong for me, but not for someone else. But of course we don't do that, because it's insane, and we know better. Relativism is probably most well recognized in the claim that there is no absolute truth. And of course, that too is self-refuting, because the claim that there is no absolute truth is an absolute truth. It's almost exhausting how ridiculous moral relativism is. It kind of always shoots itself in the foot. And this is why the moral argument can be so effective today, because people make moral claims all the time without realizing it. If everything is relative, then no one is an authority on anything that is right or wrong, and everything truly is up to you to decide. But that's not true, and we all know it. Some things are literally wrong, bad, and evil, and we know this because of God. The only true and consistent relativist is a literal sociopath. God installed a keen sense of right and wrong in our conscience. We all know that objective moral values exist because we use them every day. And it's important to notice that any amount of passionate argument against moral values or issues proves, in and of itself, that morality must be objective. Because otherwise, if it's subjective, why fight so hard for social progress or human rights? You see, another argument out there is called the argument from desire. It describes how every desire we have has a satisfactory fulfillment. I'm hungry, there's food. I'm thirsty, there's water. I'm lonely, there's friendship. I'm hurt, there's a remedy. I'm lost, there's a direction. I crave meaning and purpose. There's an objective reality with a personal God there to satisfy that desire. Where there is injustice, there is ultimately eternal justice in God's plan to rescue humanity from sin. Every desire we have has a possible satisfaction. But moral progress in a godless world makes no sense, because there is no objective good to aim for, and really no such thing as evil to fight against. You see, this is the beauty of the Christian worldview. It offers the best explanation for the way things are, as Greg Kokel tells us. People make moral claims all the time. Everyone does. Everyone uses moral language to describe things. But without an objective, transcendent, eternal, necessary source of right and wrong, anything else is subjective and therefore ultimately meaningless. And the best explanation for where moral law came from is a moral law giver. And God is the only option for a truly objective source of moral law, because he is, by definition, sinless and perfect. I'm going to show you up on the slide something that we saw at the conference I mentioned recently. It's a really good kind of clear way to put this. The argument makes a full circle, as you'll see. It goes like this. If there is no God, there is no moral lawmaker. If there is no moral lawmaker, there are no moral laws. If there are no moral laws, there are no broken moral laws. And if there are no broken moral laws, there really is no evil. But there is evil. Therefore, there are broken moral laws. Therefore, there are moral laws. Therefore, there is a moral lawmaker. Therefore, there is a God. And the final step is that this God stepped into our reality as the sinless and perfect Jesus, rejected earthly power, and gave up his life for the sins of humankind. No other religious founder did that. No other religious founder was morally perfect. On those grounds alone, why follow anyone else? I strongly recommend reading up on relativism because of how prevalent it is. The best book I've found on that topic is called Relativism. It's by Frank Beckwith and Greg Kokel. It's a wonderful read. Okay, two more. Still with me? Okay, we're going to do two more. These last two are just a little bit different. They're not as science-y. Number 6 is the reliability of the New Testament. Now, typically, we would not offer the Bible as proof for God's existence to someone who does not believe in God. Now, this is because if they don't believe in God, they won't believe that the Bible has any degree of authority. But questions of the reliability of the Bible come up all the time. I just had one come up a few weeks ago with some friends. So we need to be ready to present this, and it can make a compelling case for someone to trust what the Bible has to say. It's incredibly important for us to know that the record of Jesus' life and his followers is the most historically reliable ancient text that we have. And one of the most common challenges we hear is that the Bible is made up, full of fake stories, or that it's not trustworthy because it's been edited so much. I would say have grace on this position or this understanding because they really just haven't understood or studied the Bible. But none of that's true, and we know this thanks to a process called textual criticism. If you remember nothing else from this portion, remember this discipline of textual criticism, so that when someone critiques the Bible's reliability, all you have to say is, have you looked into textual criticism? And just let them have it. Let them go off on that and have a great time of study. You don't even have to explain all of it. Just take a look it up on Google. Google's a great tool. But textual criticism is the science of evaluating ancient documents for their credibility. And all ancient documents are subject to this process, and the standards that it uses determine how reliable they are. The main way this is evaluated is by the number of available manuscripts. And the idea is the more manuscripts and the closer they are to the events, the more reliable they would be. So on screen, it's kind of small. It was hard to get all this on screen. But on screen is the list of major ancient documents. So their number of copies, the time span between the original, and the accuracy of those copies. We can see already, if you can see it, when you compare the New Testament to all the others, which no one ever doubts. No one doubts these other documents. There is no competition. The New Testament stands far and above the rest with around 5,600 copies, less than 100 years from the events, with 99.5% accuracy. And those 5,600 copies are in Greek. There are over 19,000 copies in other languages like Syriac, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic. The total amount of manuscripts for the New Testament comes out to around 24,000. And the next best document has 643. There's no comparison. New Testament scholar Daniel Wallace points out that we have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone in the ancient world. Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, anyone. Yet no one ever doubts those other historical figures. But some will still point out that there are variants and errors in the New Testament. Now, a variant would just be an instance where the same passage is different across the copies that we have. So in the entire New Testament, of about 20,000 lines, only 40 of those lines are even doubted. And none of them have to do with any significant Christian doctrine. Leading to this quote by Dr. Peter Gurry. He says, "We are safe to claim that neither the Christian faith nor the Bible's inspiration is threatened by textual variants." Now, about supposed errors. There are two kinds of errors, accidental and intentional. Now, the vast majority of errors are accidental. Spelling mistakes, abbreviations, skipped lines, or maybe intentional ones like word order corrections. And again, none of these errors affect any significant Christian doctrine. Another way we can evaluate the reliability of the New Testament is through the examples of Jesus' followers showing that they treated other writings as authoritative. And we see this in two later New Testament passages. In 2 Peter 3:15 and 16, Peter refers to Paul's letter being among other scriptures, meaning that it was understood that Paul's letters were already known to be inspired by God. The other is 1 Timothy 5:18 and 1 Corinthians 9:9, where Paul quotes two verses. One is from Deuteronomy, and the other is from Luke 10:7. And Paul refers to both of these as scripture, meaning that Paul considered Luke to be as authoritative as the sacred Jewish texts of Moses. Another way we can see the reliability of the New Testament is through the efforts to place the events in real moments of history. All right, for instance, Luke begins his gospel by saying this: "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught." Here's the place in history. He says, "When Herod was king of Judea, there was a Jewish priest named Zechariah. He was a member of the priestly order of Abijah." Now, Luke is choosing to place this writing in a real time period which has been confirmed by historians. 1 John 1 does this as well, and even atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman treat this as reliable history. We can also find the New Testament to be reliable through outside sources. 10 non-Christian sources mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. These people have no motivation to confirm anything about him, but they verify every crucial detail of what the New Testament says about his life, death, and resurrection. Some include Josephus's The Antiquities of the Jews, the central text for Rabbinic Judaism called the Talmud, Lucian's The Death of Peregrinus, and Tacitus's The Annals. From all of these, we learn that there was a wise and virtuous sage from Judea named Jesus who had supernatural powers. A brother named James, was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, whose followers reported him alive after 3 days, and who had a following of people called Christians who believed in immortality and worshiped Jesus as God. All of that from outside of the Bible. Along with this, we also have the incredible amount of recorded prophecy which was fulfilled by Jesus, and the embarrassing details of Jesus' followers, which leads us to believe that their writings are honest. Sir Frederick Kenyon is another famous New Testament critic, and he said the following: "It is reassuring at the end to find that the general result of all these discoveries and all this study is to strengthen the proof of the authenticity of the Scriptures, and our conviction that we have in our hands, in substantial integrity, is the veritable Word of God." Now, knowing that the New Testament can be trusted, this means that everything recorded in there is true and that it actually happened. The miracles Jesus performed, the healing, deliverance, and commanding nature, all that is real. Miracles were the test of a prophet of God, and Jesus' followers did some of them too. The miracles are one thing, but what these other people did not do was defeat death and rise from the dead as Jesus did. This is the event that our entire faith hinges on, and it is our final argument for the existence of God this morning. Number 7 is the resurrection of Jesus. The case for the resurrection of Jesus is so historically solid that it should cause anyone to pause and consider who Jesus really was. Now, using the fact that someone came back from the dead might not usually be our go-to proof for God. I would say this might be because we understand that our society would find it silly, or at least we've been conditioned to think that. But Christianity lives or dies on the resurrection of Jesus. So this should be our most powerful argument. And there actually is really good proof for the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, we just proved that the New Testament is an accurate record of history which contains Jesus' resurrection. but there's more. I currently have 3 of the eventual 4 volumes of what will be the most robust and deeply researched work on the resurrection ever. It is called On the Resurrection by Dr. Gary Habermas. It totals his 50 years of research as the leading expert on this topic. Like I said, 4 volumes. The 4th is not out yet, but 4 total volumes all covering this topic. The first volume is around 1,000 pages of evidence for the resurrection. The second volume is around 1,000 pages refuting arguments against it. And the third volume is another 1,000 pages, a collection of all the scholarly perspectives and the nature of historical research. In volume 4, which will cover the practical implications and applications of the resurrection. Habermas has championed what he calls the minimal facts approach. So when we're discussing the facts of the resurrection, there's a lot of things we can point to, but he says, why waste our time trying to memorize all these 12 core facts when we can rest more solidly on the 6 that are incredibly airtight? All right, don't have time to go in depth into each of these, but that's kind of what these resources are for in those sheets. Let me just lay out these 6 minimal facts, and we'll kind of look at each of them. So first is Jesus' death. Right, the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion is agreed upon by modern Christian and non-Christian scholars, as well as by ancient Jewish and Roman sources. Second is the disciples' experiences. The numerous post-resurrection experiences of Jesus are kind of the heart of the argument. Third is the early proclamation of the gospel, the immediacy and widespread nature of the disciples' teaching. Fourth is the transformation of the disciples. The fact that these disciples went so quickly from grief to proclamation while facing the threat of death. Now, why would they all face death willingly if they knew it was a lie? Fifth is the conversion of James. Jesus' own brother is known to have converted because of seeing the resurrected Jesus. And sixth is the conversion of Paul. Similar to James, Paul, who was once an enemy of God, is met by the resurrected Jesus and ends up as one of Christianity's most important figures. Remember, there are more rock-solid facts, like the empty tomb and Jesus' burial. But all this to say, the resurrection of Jesus is not just a story from the Bible. It's a historical fact, and one that can be very strongly defended. And we should know that if Jesus really did rise from the dead, that means that everything that he said and did, including his claims to be God, are true. That is why our faith rests on this event. And Paul reminds us that if this did not happen, we are to be pitied. So, those are 7 powerful arguments for the existence of God. And there are many more which have been constructed and defended throughout time. But now, how can apologetics really meet our modern world? For this, we need to take a look at what our modern world really thinks. So think back to the relativism, subjective truth. So first, apologetics can provide proof for objective truth, right? But it can also answer some of the most burning questions. There was a framework for understanding modern apologetics that I learned recently, which I found really helpful. We can see the most pressing questions through these 3 E's: existential, ethical, and embodied apologetics. Here's what they mean. Existential apologetics will deal with questions about existence, emphasizing individual responsibility and the freedom to create meaning in a seemingly meaningless world where individuals determine their own choices and actions. This would be in how we would address questions like, is happiness the ultimate goal in life? How do we accept others who disagree with us? Is it always someone else's fault when something goes wrong? How do I understand my identity? Those would all be existential questions that apologetics can help with. Next is ethical apologetics. This emphasizes moral principles. Humans have always wrestled with ethical problems, but we now have the internet at our fingertips and can witness, evaluate, and speak on ethical issues going on all around the world. So how can you use justice, love, and compassion to address questions about the existence of God. And lastly is embodied apologetics. This is crucial and has long been one of the best apologetic methods of all time for Christians. It has an incredibly high success rate. Embodied apologetics is simply embodying Christ in your daily life, living the way of Jesus for all to see. Nothing proves God more than you living on mission with Jesus in every area of your life. Existential, ethical, and embodied apologetics. It's kind of a great way to narrow down a lot of what we've talked about and focus in on the most pressing needs right now. Okay, what about some tips for conversations, okay, and tough conversations? This is a much larger discussion and something that takes a lot of practice, but I've learned that there are really only 3 questions you need to know. They are, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And how do you know that is true? Here's the thing, questions are amazing. They're innocent. They get someone talking. They help clarify someone's position so you don't end up arguing against a straw man, and they don't require you to prove anything. The big rule is whoever makes a claim bears the burden of proof. Okay? Please don't hear me say never make a claim. You will have to make claims in life, like the claim that you believe in God or follow Jesus. What I'm saying is that questions can protect you from having to prove anything, and they open up a dialogue that will take you much farther than just going around throwing facts at people. What is so important about this last one, too, is that you'll be surprised to find out how many people arrive at conclusions and opinions and ideas based off of very little understanding. Now, here's a great pro tip. This is the mantra I live by, and it comes from Preston Sprinkle. He's an amazing New Testament scholar. The strength of my opinion should match the depth of my research. What is this projecting? Humility. So I'm not an expert on everything. So when I don't know about a topic, I hold my opinions loosely, and I'm open about where I got my information. But if there's a topic I've put a great deal of time into, like apologetics, I hold those opinions pretty strongly because I have plumbed the depths of the research. The strength of my opinion should match the depth of my research. Have your opinions on things, but hold them with humility. One of the best postures you can hold to is just to constantly ask yourself, is it possible that I'm wrong about this? To never lose that willingness to continue learning. When you ask this last question, how do you know that's true? You'll typically get the same answers. I saw it in the news. I read it in an article. It's just common sense, and things like that. To which you can respond, and how do you know that you can trust these sources? Have you looked into any sources which might disagree? Is it possible you've been fed a narrative by the in-group that you belong to? We often don't take that time to stop and really examine how we actually know something to be true. When I've asked youth students over the years why they believe in God, their usual answer is because my parents do. Parents, please understand how dangerous this is. If this is the only reason someone believes in God, their faith will likely crumble the moment it gets tested. So use questions. They're so helpful. And don't use them only for the purpose of opening up an opportunity for you to get a word in. Okay? Actually listen to what someone's saying. Maybe you don't even get the chance to chime in with your own thoughts. In fact, the Jesus way is to sacrifice what you want, letting the other person have the last word and choosing to stay in touch and meet again, trusting that God will open the door for a future opportunity. You've started a dialogue, and that can go a long way. So, to summarize, here's why I believe in God. My belief in God is based simultaneously on philosophical foundations, personal experience, history, archaeology, science, textual criticism, and the resurrection of Jesus. The multiplicity of all this evidence seem overwhelming against any other view. This is a cumulative case approach, where multiple independent lines of evidence all converge to support the same conclusion. This method is compelling precisely because it does not rest on a single proof, but on the combined weight of many mutually reinforcing reasons. I see other worldviews as lacking explanatory power, not just for God, but for the mind, morality, origin of the universe, historical claims of Christianity, and personal experience of the divine. Like we've talked about, specifically with atheism, life ends up having no purpose or meaning other than what each person might subjectively assign to it. And the logical conclusion of atheism is that my life doesn't matter in the grand scheme of the universe. If atheism is true, we are just the product of blind, unguided processes with no transcendent goal or cause. Never mind the fact that that's kind of completely inconsistent because we're choosing to trust this mind, which is, as they would believe, the result of a blind, unguided process. Our belief in God is not a blind leap of faith, nor merely emotional. It's reasoned, informed, and multifaceted. This worldview resonates with what people intuitively feel, that love, justice, truth, and beauty are real and meaningful, not illusions, that our lives matter, that our suffering is not random, and that death is not the end. Given everything I've laid out from today and last week, wouldn't you say that it seems not only more plausible, but more practical and meaningful to believe in God? Belief in God, specifically the God of the Bible, is both rationally strong and existentially satisfying. And again, this view is not rooted in wishful thinking or blind faith, but in a carefully constructed and multifaceted argument. We're not just believing because it's comforting. We're believing because, given the evidence, it appears to be true. If you want a short and sweet answer to why you believe in God, use this. Christianity offers the best explanation for reality, and Jesus has touched my life in a unique way. Here's how, and then go on to share your testimony. But my ability to explain the evidence, to explain all this stuff we've talked about, while important, is not the foundation. What I want to invite others to do is what every real seeker must do: encounter Jesus directly through scripture, reflection, and honest questions. I would either invite them to something like Alpha or send them straight to the Gospel of John. It's both accessible and profound. The Gospel of John presents Jesus not only as a historical figure, but as the eternal Word, the source of life, truth, and grace. And for someone earnestly seeking, John's Gospel invites a direct personal encounter with Christ, not just a set of doctrines or arguments. And there's something fundamentally different about discovering a truth versus being told one. Both can help, but only one transforms. I am trusting that truth, if sought honestly, will reveal itself. Again, these arguments don't save anyone or prove anything without a doubt. There's still doubts that remain. And we see them presented in many continuing challenges, which is why the witness for the existence of God is a relationship. These arguments are all powerful, logically sound, passionately defended by some of the smartest people in the world, but Proverbs reminds us that the right word spoken at the right time is like a fine piece of jewelry, which, if we turn that inside out, also tells us that the wrong word spoken at the wrong time can be very dangerous. So for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, it is up to us to embody this truth that we've learned today and last week. By that I mean that we live our lives according to this truth. We let our actions do the convincing for others. And like I started with, Questions regarding truth and the existence of God are becoming more and more common in a post-truth world. So we would be wise to understand what we've learned so that we can fulfill the Apostle Peter's command to give a reason for the faith that we have when someone asks. We share our testimony first, the proof of a life changed by God, which overflows with the fruit of the Spirit. Your own transformed life and the public witness of a life lived in the way of Jesus is the most powerful evidence for God. Which is why when people claim to be Christians but don't live the way of Jesus, people are either completely turned off or fall into a distorted version of Christianity. I would also encourage you to maybe check out Nabil Qureshi's testimony, because it illustrates a lot of what I'm saying really beautifully. One where apologetics, relationship, and a divine vision all lead to conversion. All three are evidences of God's divine intervention in someone's life. He loved to debate Christians when he didn't believe because they never had a good answer. And then he met someone that did. And it put a stone in his shoe. And it got him thinking. And then he had a lifelong relationship with this guy named David Wood, who embodied Jesus to him. And then at a certain point, Nabil Qureshi, who was a Muslim, as it happens for many, had a divine vision and a dream of a threshold of a door with a wedding feast on the other side saying, you can either cross through or you can stay out here. And he chose to cross through and converted and became a powerful apologist for the Christian faith. He unfortunately passed away, but you can find him very easily on YouTube. Though science and history are not the only proofs for God, a lot of what we've talked about, John Lennox reminds us that because God is a person and not a theory, it is to be expected that one of the prime evidences for his existence is personal experience. Now, I love all of this data that we've covered and all the information presented. I love all this stuff. So use that data and information in the right context with those who are curious and with grace and humility. Be merciful to those who doubt. Don't forget the fact that people are watching your actions far more than they are listening to your words. Okay, there's so much more that I would love to cover and dissect, and maybe that'll be like a full class in the future, because this topic is just so massive. Of the three most common objections to Christianity, we really only touched on two of them, the existence of God and the reliability of the Bible. The other, which we did not touch on, is the problem of evil and suffering. And that's a really sensitive and delicate topic, but it's not impossible. At the Connect desk, again, are these resource sheets containing a ton of material and books and things you can read about. There's descriptions of what each book is, so if one particular topic piqued your interest, just look for what the book's about and maybe grab a copy and give it a read. And then also, like I've said, in the video description of these sermons on YouTube is a link to a folder that has even more stuff. And it also contains basically what might be part 3 of this series. It's kind of a complete but shorter message on the problem of evil and suffering that you can read and you can have. So if you missed that, if you really wanted to hear more about the problem of evil specifically, go ahead and grab that, or I can help you find it, or print you off a copy if you want it. To close, though, I really do truly hope that these past 2 weeks have served as a way to encourage you in your faith and to help you be better conversationalists, and that you can be courageous in defending what you know to be true. Christianity has the most amount of logic, reason, and justification behind it out of any worldview. So when someone asks you, why Christianity and not some other religion? You can say, well, because given the evidence, no other religion comes close. Because no other religious founder was morally perfect. Because Christianity offers the best explanation for the way things are. And because the way of Jesus, who has transformed my life, our life, is the best way to live. If you don't believe it, just put it into practice. See if it works. I would also say that the creed of the scientific method is to examine all the evidence, weigh it accordingly, and objectively, and then base your conclusions on the best evidence. So I'd say be a credible scientist and follow the evidence where it leads. I promise it leads to God. At the end of his masterpiece on fine-tuning, one last thing from John Lennox. He leaves us with this famous line. He says, "We all have to choose the presupposition with which we start. There are essentially two options. Either human intelligence owes its origin to mindless matter, or there is a creator. It's strange that some people claim that it is their intelligence that leads them to prefer mindless matter over a creator." Hopefully, we've all been reminded of the God that we worship, who is a historically documented divine beginner, fine-tuner, author of life, cosmic conscience, moral law giver, miracle worker, and who stepped into reality in the form of Jesus and rose from the dead for the forgiveness of our sins so that we could be reconciled back to God and could spend eternity in worship of him. As I've shown you, in excruciating detail, I'm sure, creation proclaims the glory of God, and this God is worthy of your worship. So let's do that. Let's stand and worship and pray. Lord of all creation, the good and perfect God of salvation, we adore you. We are in awe of you. When we look at the world around us and the miracle of human life, we cannot help but just be awestruck about how incredible you are. I know for me, the more I've studied apologetics, the more my faith has grown in you, God. This is because I have been learning and exposing myself more and more to all the amazing ways that you have revealed yourself to us. How you've demonstrated your infinite power and your love for all creation. God, I pray that we would not go out of here feeling all puffed up and smart, like we have this intellectual high road. I actually pray the opposite, that we would be humbled before you, God. We need to be reminded of just how small we are sometimes. Holy Spirit, I ask that you give this body of believers refreshed confidence in their faith. None of this information was required in order to be a follower of you, but you have simply given it to us so that we can know you better. I pray that we would all be better witnesses of you in our daily lives, that we wouldn't get caught up in culture wars and fruitless arguments, but that we would know you, Jesus, so well that your ways become habitual in our lives. We know that this is how the gospel spreads. You've chosen to use us. We love you, Lord, and we are humbled and grateful that we get to worship you. Amen.